Question 1. Every Wednesday on a weekly basis for over 50 years, Nadia Bollinger would invite her current pupils to her Parisian apartment for an afternoon of, I don't know, crumpets and tea. Although that's actually probably England, not Paris. But anyway, on the SAT, they would consider this redundant because if you're going to say every Wednesday, it kind of implies that this is going on a weekly basis. So you don't actually need to say both. So let's look at the answers. A is obviously out. On Wednesdays, that is every week. So same thing that's wrong with choice A. Choice C, every Wednesday seems to solve the problem just by getting rid of that part. Choice D, each and every Wednesday in her apartment. So, you might say each and every Wednesday when you're like speaking like colloquial language, but for these types of written passages, they generally probably don't want you to be that informal. So you might argue that each and every is a little bit redundant. I think it's a little bit informal, and so C is kind of the best choice. So we'll go with that one. Question 2, which choice most effectively combines the underlined sentences? So whenever the SAT in the writing section tells you to do something, you want to make sure you do it precisely as they say. So it says, some of the 20th century's greatest composers attended these intellectually rigorous weekly gatherings. They were just some of the attendees. All right, so how are we going to combine these? Let's look at choice A. Of the attendees at these intellectually rigorous weekly gatherings, some of them were among the 20th century's greatest composers. So at first glance, this probably strikes you as a little bit wordy. If you're going to mention that there were attendees, why would you have to say like some of them again? If we were to fix choice A, I would say of the attendees at these intellectually rigorous weekly gatherings, some were among the 20th century's greatest composers. It's a small correction, but it does feel a little bit wordy. So let's see if there's anything else. We'll keep that around. Choice B. These intellectually rigorous weekly gatherings had attendees, and among them were some of the 20th century's greatest composers. So B is similar to A. Notice what it does though. In the first part before the comma, we have this main verb. These weekly gatherings had attendees, and among them were some of the 20th century's greatest composers. You can argue that this is also sort of redundant like choice A. The difference is choice A starts out with this preposition phrase. Here we kind of have two independent clauses and it's connected with the word and. So generally in terms of style, it's better to have an independent and then a dependent clause. So in terms of style, this is probably not the greatest. I would go with A if it were corrected over B. Let's see what else they have. Choice C, some of the 20th century's greatest composers attended because these were intellectually rigorous weekly gatherings. Notice that C changes the meaning. It's actually saying that the reason that they attended is because the gatherings were intellectually rigorous. This was never said in the original passage. So generally on the test, the SAT does not like it if you change the meaning. Now the one exception to this would be if the original passage was trying to say something and they did it ineffectively, and it's pretty obvious they were trying to say this, but they couldn't do it. And then the answer choice would actually make that happen successfully. That would be the one time where you could argue change of meaning is valid. But here, there's no real necessary reason why they're attending the meetings was because they're intellectually rigorous. They're basically just introducing a new idea. So C is definitely going to be out. Choice D, among the attendees to these intellectually rigorous weekly gatherings were some of the 20th century's greatest composers. So I want to compare D and A because they're very similar. They start off with this preposition phrase, among these attendees to these weekly gatherings. But look what happens. After the preposition phrase, there's a verb and then there's a subject. So when the verb comes before the subject, it's called an inverted sentence. So why are they inverting the sentence? It's often done when you start with a really long preposition phrase. So if you said like, among the people living on my block, many were doctors, or among the people living on my block were many doctors. Whether you invert it or not, I think is less of an issue. But it's often done because sometimes it just is more efficient. So either way, it's better than choice A because, again, with this phrase here, some of them, it does sound kind of redundant. So I'm going to go with choice D, and that'll be the answer. Question 3, which choice best sets up the main idea of the next paragraph? So start reading here. Boulanger, a gifted performer and composer in her own right, was famous for her demanding curriculum that stressed not only the obligations composers have to their audience, but also the need for every student to discover his or her own individuality as a composer. So again, you can't answer this question until you've actually read the paragraph, so save this for later. But when you come back to it, is the main idea of the paragraph that there are obligations composers have to their audience? Definitely not, because what she talks about in the next paragraph is that her teaching was fundamentals of classic music, music theory, listening skills, harmony, counterpoint, those types of things. So really what they're saying is that all those things fall under the category of musical form. Form has to do with like the technical aspects, harmony, counterpoint, things like that. What else does it say? Advantages of dramatic formats like opera, not really talked about. The value of learning to play several instruments. Also, I don't think that's mentioned in that paragraph. Question 4, start here. During her private lessons and weekly gatherings, Boulanger leads line-by-line analyses of famous musical compositions, and we can stop there. So this is clearly a tense type of question. This is happening in the past, we know this. So it doesn't really make sense to say that during her private lessons, Boulanger leads, because that's present tense. What's the next choice? B. During her private lessons, Boulanger would lead. Would is actually okay, because here you're using it as what's called an auxiliary verb. And in this particular case, when you use would in the past, you're generally talking about something that happened pretty regularly, like a habitual action. So you can say something like, last year, every morning, I would wake up at 8 because of my job. And so that's an okay usage of would. Choice C, during her private lessons, Boulanger will lead. Again, doesn't make sense because this was happening in the past. Choice D, during her private lessons, Boulanger has been leading. So has been, this tense is past perfect or present perfect. And present perfect is used either for something that's been going on, like an ongoing thing. So you can say, I have been teaching SAT for quite some time. Or it's like something that's been going on up until now, like I have been expecting your arrival and now you just arrived. So also not really appropriate for what they're saying here. By the way, what I would do is I would sort of Google the word would and type in would as an auxiliary verb, and you should be able to find a lot of different usages of the word. So, you know, some of the most common would be something that would happen in the future. If you said, like my friend said that she would meet us at 5 o'clock. So again, you're talking about something in the past, but she's talking about something in the future. Another usage is, like we just said, habits that happened in the past. You could also talk about something that is a condition. So you could say something like, if it were up to me, I would do this. And that usually coincides with the subjunctive mood. Question 5, so you want to start on the previous page. It says, during her private lessons, Boulanger would lead line-by-line analyses of famous musical compositions, identifying their structures and what she discerned as their weaknesses as well. So this is a participle phrase because you're basically turning a verb into an adjective. And let's see what they say. Choice A sounds okay. She would do this, and it means like as she was leading, she was also identifying their structures and what she discerned as their weaknesses. So A is okay. B, this is actually a problem about possession, because notice all the answer choices put an apostrophe at some point. So she would identify their structures and what she discerned as their weaknesses. I don't really know what it means to say that weaknesses, it would have to be something that the weaknesses had possession of. It doesn't really make sense to put an apostrophe there because the weaknesses is not possessing anything. Choice C, identifying their structures and what she discerned as their weaknesses. So again, you're putting a possessive in front of structures and weaknesses. The only way C would make sense is if you said something like identifying their structures' weaknesses, but again, that would be changing the meaning. That would mean that like the weaknesses were belonging to the structures, but again, putting a possessive after weaknesses also doesn't make sense. Identifying their structures and what she discerned as their weaknesses. So problem is that we still have the possessive here, which doesn't make sense. And so the answer is going to be A. The difference, by the way, of putting an apostrophe S versus S apostrophe means if the original is singular, it gets a apostrophe S. If the original is plural and ends with an S, you put the apostrophe afterwards. Question 6, start over here. From these intensive sessions with Bollinger, Glass claims that he learned to hear. So here, obviously, the question is punctuation. Do we need any kind of punctuation after the word that? And the answer is really no. Sometimes you do use a comma to introduce a quotation, but that's only if the quotation doesn't fit in grammatically with the sentence. So an example of that would be usually something quoted directly. So if you said Glass claimed, comma, quote, you are a liar. Here it would be appropriate to put a comma because you're introducing a quotation. However, if you say something where the grammar flows, such as Glass claimed that he is a liar. I don't know who he is. Here, you don't actually need a comma because it flows smoothly. So similarly here, you don't need a comma anywhere before the quotations, and you certainly don't need a comma after that in normal English. So if we had just paraphrased what Glass said, and if it said Glass said that John is a liar, this is not even a quotation, but you would never put a comma after that. It's just not necessary. In fact, you don't need any punctuation after the word that. And so basically that means that the only choice that makes sense is going to be choice B, because you don't need a colon, you don't need a dash either. And the other reason to keep in mind that when you're using colons and dashes, you typically have a complete sentence or an independent clause before the colon or before the dash. It's very weird for a colon and a dash to kind of interrupt a sentence midway. So that's another reason you know that it's not appropriate there. Question 7, to make this paragraph most logical, sentence 1 should be placed. So let's read sentence 1. It says, central to Bollinger's teaching was her insistence that students master the fundamentals of classic music, which to her meant gaining proficiency in music theory and analysis while also cultivating listening skills. So the answer is actually going to be leaving it right here. And the reason is that this serves as a good topic sentence, because every other sentence talks about specific things like harmony, counterpoint, and line-by-line analyses of musical compositions and structures. And all of that can be said to be under the topic of fundamentals of classic music, music theory, and analysis. So it serves as a good introduction to all the other sentences in the paragraph. And so for that one, their answer was basically just leave it as it is now. If you picked any of the others, it would be like starting off with the details, then going back to a topic sentence, and then adding on more details afterwards. So for 7, A is going to make the most sense. Question 8, which choice best sets up the information that follows in the sentence? So we can start here. Jones, one of the few jazz musicians to study with Bollinger, went on to compose dozens of film scores and produce some of the most iconic pop albums of the century, such as Michael Jackson's hit Thriller. All right, so what's going on? This is asking, it sounds like it's asking about content, but really the answer choices are more, grammatical. So what are they doing? They're eliminating in B, C, D the comma after Bollinger. So is that necessary? It actually is, because notice that the sentence reads smoothly if you said Jones went on to compose dozens of film scores and produce blah, blah, blah. So that's the main sentence. What's going on between the commas is this whole thing is describing Jones, and I think it's in a positive. And given that it's not grammatically necessary to the sentence, or it's not part of the main one, you're setting it off with 2 commas. So it's kind of like parentheses. So given that you're starting with 1 comma, you do need to close it off with another comma. That's something that we see on the SAT pretty often. So all of these are going to be wrong simply because they don't have a comma after Bollinger. And so the answer is going to be A. Notice what else B, C, and D do wrong. They interrupt the phrases with either a dash or they stick an unnecessary comma here. C, they don't do that, but again, it's still missing the comma there. So for 8, A is going to be the best answer. Question 9, which choice best supports the information that follows in the sentence? So information that follows. It's going to say, to Bollinger, who once taught the composer of the musical Bye Bye Birdie, it was only natural that her pupils would take such diverse paths and make such unique music. So does the fact that she taught the composer of Bye Bye Birdie lead to students taking diverse paths? I don't know, because I don't know anything about Bye Bye Birdie. So most likely it's not going to be A. Let's see what the other choices are. To Bollinger, who held that one must first master the rules of composition before breaking them. I can see B is possibly related, because if you break the rules and then you make diverse paths and unique music, so I think it's definitely better than A. Choice C, to Bollinger, who taught for years at the American Conservatory at Fontainebleau. This has nothing to do with the next sentence. This is just saying where she taught, so definitely not. D, to Bollinger, who believed that composers must find ways to individuate themselves. So they're thinking that individuating yourself, meaning to say making yourself an individual, is close to picking a diverse path and making unique music, and so their answer is going to be D. I think B is okay, but I also think that D is definitely better. Question 10, start reading here. Above all, Bollinger was truly dedicated to music, and she passed on a legacy of musical devotion to several generations of composers. So clearly this is the wrong word. This is diction, which means word choice. You need an actual verb here. Past is an adjective, so like past tense or past time or something. What are they really trying to say? They're trying to say passed on, because the verb should be pass. And again, the 3 forms of pass is pass, passed, and had passed. Again, every verb has 3 forms that you should pretty much be able to produce. So that's what we're looking for. Anything else, choice B, again, would make the sentence have no verb. And the difference between C and D is that's actually idiom. Idiom means how you combine words. So is it better to say that you passed on a legacy or passed for a legacy? Again, the idea of giving something means that you generally pass something on to like another person. So on is better than for if it's a choice between C and D. What would pass for mean? One thing I can think of is like if you are wearing a disguise and you say like, I passed for my cousin when I was wearing that wig. I think you could say something like that. So it would basically just be changing the meaning. So for 10, we're going to go with choice C. Question 11, the writer wants a conclusion that summarizes the passage's discussion of Bollinger's legacy. Which choice best accomplishes this goal? She famously once said, false notes can be forgiven, false music cannot, and Bollinger became renowned more for her teaching than her own musical compositions. I think that's okay. Obviously, about half the passage does emphasize her teaching. We'll keep it around. Maybe there's something better. Bollinger will long be remembered for her formidable knowledge of composers and compositions, as well as her own musical skills. So again, nothing about her teaching, nothing about teaching her students to be individuals. B is probably not going to work. C, taught her pupils the foundational skills that allowed them to be trailblazers, true to their own creative impulses. So this is definitely true when we're talking about being individuals. Trailblazer is someone who kind of forges, new ways of doing things. So C is okay. D, Bollinger never claimed to be able to inspire creativity in her students, only to train them in technical matters. So this is kind of the opposite. Technical matters would be the things that were the basics that she discussed, like form, harmony. But then after that, she clearly wanted them to be creative. So she didn't only want to do technical stuff. So D is out. So if it's a choice between A and C, C seems to be a little bit better because the passage does move towards talking about like how her teaching emphasized them as individuals. So we'll go with that, and that's the answer. Question 12, you can start at the beginning. When a fossilized millipede called Pseudomodesmus pneumony was discovered in Scotland in 2004. Its estimated age led researchers to conclude it could be the oldest air-breathing animal. So if you'll notice, all the answers have to do with possessive, right? And so it says its estimated age. So the question is, who does the age belong to? And the answer is the age belongs to this millipede, which is like some kind of an animal. So it's singular, which means you're going to cross off plural possessive. There is a contraction of they are, so that doesn't make sense. And then the question is, do we need the apostrophe or do we not need the apostrophe? For possessive, we do not need the apostrophe because it apostrophe s always means it is. So you can actually think of this as a diction problem. In other words, it's either word choice, it's versus it apostrophe s, or you could think of it as just proper use of possessive. So the answer is going to be D. Question 13, moving on, it would take the efforts of a determined University of Texas student to show a flaw in it. So notice that all the choices clarify what it is. This is an ambiguous pronoun. In other words, we don't know what it is referring to. On the SAT, you want to be very clear whenever you're using pronouns, he, she, it, they, them. What exactly are you referring to previously? So them and those don't really solve this problem. What exactly had a flaw? It specifically was the hypothesis. So B is really the only one that clarifies the ambiguity of that pronoun. And so the hypothesis specifically was that it was the oldest air-breathing animal. Question 14, which choice most effectively combines the sentences at the underlined portion? Start over here. The fossil was initially dated to around 428 million years ago. This dating of the fossil was based on the abundance of period-specific plant spores found in the nearby sediment. So obviously we want to combine these because we use the word dated twice, which stylistically is not great. So let's see what they come up with. The fossil was dated to 428 million years ago, with this being based on the abundance. So this is just kind of wordy, not a great phrase. A is probably not going to work. Dated to around 428 million years ago, colon, initial dating was based on blah, blah, blah. So again, we're not really solving the problem of using the word dating twice, so you can argue that this is still kind of redundant. Choice C, it was dated to 428 million years ago, based on the abundance of period-specific plants. So C sounds like it works because right after your main clause, it was dated to 428 million years ago. Then you add based on, which technically speaking is a participle. You take the verb to base and you put it in past tense, and now it's acting like an adjective. It was based on the abundance of blah, blah, blah. So this one works. With participles, you usually use commas, but sometimes it's not necessary. Notice they're not even giving us that choice here. So we'll go with C for now. Choice D is initially dated to 428 million years ago, and the dating was. So notice D is the same as B because they're repeating the word dating. So that means the best choice is C. Question 15, start over here. Professor Elizabeth Catlos of the Jackson School of Geosciences at the University of Texas at Austin knew that radiometric analysis could provide a more accurate age, but such an analysis had blah, 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 blah. All right, so what's going on here? The question is, first, do we need a comma right over here? Now notice how the sentence is phrased. It says, Professor Elizabeth Carlos of the Jackson School of Geosciences. So we've got two preposition phrases. Here's one, at the University of Texas, at Austin. You can argue that this is three preposition phrases. They might actually, you might actually argue that they're kind of nested within each other. But regardless, generally in English, for setting off preposition phrases, you do not need commas. So you really just don't need this comma here, which is why the answer is going to be C. What I want to point out is, when would an appropriate use of commas be used? If it said something like Professor Elizabeth Catlos, comma, and then it said something longest professor working at University of Texas, comma, new. In this particular case, and we will see this on the SAT, you've got a description of Professor Catlos. I think it's in a positive, set off by commas, which is kind of functioning like parentheses. And in that particular case, a comma would be appropriate. But there's no comma up here, and these are all preposition phrases. So that's why C is going to be the best answer. Look at choice B. There is no reason to interrupt the verb and the object with a colon. So, if it's subject, verb, object, you never put a colon between the verb and the object. And again, like we said before, generally before the colon, you usually have a complete sentence. So B's not going to work. Choice D, Professor Elizabeth Catlos at Austin. So if you choose choice D, you no longer have a complete sentence before the semicolon. So with semicolons, you need a complete sentence before and after. And so that's why D is not going to work. Question 16, such an analysis had not been performed because researchers were unable to extract the necessary minerals that they required from soil samples. So what's going on here? Notice that all the answers are basically just repeating the idea of necessary. So the original says necessary minerals that they required. So obviously if the minerals were necessary, it's obvious that they were required. So again, this is redundant. You don't need to say both because one means the same as the other. So A is going to be out. B, unable to extract the minerals that they needed to extract for analysis. So that's interesting. They're repeating the word extract. And so that's obviously doesn't really sound very good. So we can eliminate that. Choice C, they're unable to extract the necessary minerals from soil samples. So choice C sounds okay because we're just saying necessary once and then they're saying where it's from. Choice D, unable to extract the minerals that were necessarily needed. So obviously it's weird to say necessarily needed. That's like saying you are a funny person. So anyway, these words both mean the same thing, so it's also redundant. And C is going to be the answer. Question 17, start over here. Catlos believed that zircon grains or zircons could... What are zircons? Why does that sound like something with Superman? Was Superman? No, Superman was from Krypton. Oh, zircon probably sounds like cubic zirconia, which is like those fake diamonds. All right, but anyway, the zircons could be found in the samples. She asked her student, Stephanie Suarez, to find them. So notice what's going on here. You actually have two complete sentences. She believed they could be found in samples, period. New sentence. She asked her student, Stephanie Suarez, to find them. So either we need to separate this or combine it in a, a loud way. Let's see what they do. Samples and... So again, with a semicolon, you need two independent clauses, left and right. So if you start a sentence with and, it doesn't make sense to use a semicolon right before. That's never going to work. C actually just puts a comma between two complete sentences, which is a comma splice. You can't do that also. You need to use a comma plus a conjunction. And that's exactly what D is doing. It says, Catlos believed that they could be found in the samples, and she asked her student Stephanie Suarez to find them. So D separates the two or connects the two independent clauses by using the conjunction and. So D is going to work. Question 18, start here. This technique worked, yielding numerous grains of zircon from two of the beds. All right, so what's going on? You notice that this first part up to the semicolon is a complete sentence. It's an independent clause, has a subject and a verb. Then they tack on this participle phrase. Participle is a verbal adjective. You take the verb to yield, you add an ing. Now it becomes a present participle, and it's acting as an adjective. And what is it describing? It's describing the noun technique. So when you're using a participle, and by the way, that participles are great, they work well. You typically set off the participle with a comma, not with a semicolon. Because remember, with semicolon, you want to have two independent clauses. So that automatically brings us to the answer C, which is typically how you use a participle. Let's look at the others. Choice B. Notice choice B is a comma splice, because if you say it, now you've got a new subject. So now you've got a complete sentence to the left and to the right of the comma splice. Choice D. This technique worked and yielding numerous grains. So this is kind of weird. D is kind of like using a participle, but you're sticking the word and. It's kind of not necessary. It makes you feel like, what is the subject? If you were to correct D, you'd have to say something like, this technique worked and ended up yielding numerous grains. That would work. Or I'm trying to think of others. This technique worked and yielded. Yeah, if you say yielded, because then it would be parallel with worked, then that would make sense. But again, using yielding, which is typically a participle, does not make sense here. So we'll go with C. Question 19, the writer wants to add the following sentence. She first tried to separate the zircons from volcanic ash in the samples by crushing the minerals up and applying an organic solvent, but this method proved ineffective. So first is like, tells you a clue that this is a process. So she did this first. Now, does that mean it's going to happen in the beginning of the paragraph? Maybe, maybe not. So we kind of just have to look. All right, so going back, notice what it says in sentence 1. Suarez received the soil samples from the 3 beds near the one where the millipede fossil was found. That's a good introductory sentence. So you probably don't want to stick the added sentence beforehand. That wouldn't make sense. Notice what sentence 2 says. The ashes clumped together and no zircons sank to the bottom. That sounds like a failure, and that would make sense if you said she first tried to separate them, but it was ineffective and no zircons sank to the bottom. So their answer is going to be basically after sentence 1, because again, it's that process. She tried to do something, didn't work, and the sentence 2, where it talks about the ashes clumping together. Those are the details of why it didn't work. And sentence 3 kind of emphasizes that it was very messy and unsuccessful. Question 20, which most accurately represents the information in the table? And these tables are in the writing section, so they don't really need a lot of interpretation. 20, start here. However, they also discovered that some were much younger, including a grain in bed 16 cow 3, dated to 420 million years ago, and one in 16 cal 1 dated to blah blah blah. All right, so we care about the one that's in cal 3, that's over here. They're saying it's dated to 420 million years ago, so we only have like 5 choices. None of these say 420 million years ago. So glancing at the answer choices, is there one that says 413? No. 414.3? Yes, right here. 418.8, not in 16 cal 3. So it's really just find the one that has the answer, and so that's going to be choice C. Question 21, which represents the information in the table. So start here. A total of 2 grains in cal 3 and 8 in cal 1, dated to the Devonian period, which lasted from 419 to 358.9 million years ago. So looking at the answer choices, you basically see this is a question of how many are in each period, right? So our range is 419 to 358. Obviously, none of these are in the 300s. So what are we looking for? We're looking for something that's less than 419.2. So what I would do is just go through each one and check off any numbers that are less than 419.2. That's this one, this one, this one, not that one, not that one. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, 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 but not the last. So how many of that is in 16 cal 3? That's 3. And how many are in 16 cal 1? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in cal 1. And that's choice D, because 3 there and 7 there. So that's really all you got to do for that one. 22, which most effectively concludes the passage. It says, together with Catlos and 2 other scientists, Suarez published her results in the journal +1. Thanks to Suarez, the search for the oldest air-breathing animal now continues. So what's a good conclusion? That one sounds okay, because obviously we opened up by talking about, was this the oldest animal, and it was not. So A is okay. Let's read it. The tricky problem of how to extract zircons. So extracting zircons was part of the passage. It wasn't the main idea, though. It was just one of the things she had to do to reach her conclusions. Thanks to Suarez, the important data about the Devonian period were discovered. It's okay, but it's probably a little too broad. It doesn't really conclude the passage well. Choice D, thanks to her, researchers have a new reason to be interested in ancient soil beds. I don't know. What's the new reason? Because they couldn't figure out the mystery. So, I mean, D's okay, but again, I think the best one is going to be choice A, because it kind of echoes what was said in the first paragraph, and that's kind of the main issue here. Question 23. In the workplace, managers' expectations regularly become self-fulfilling prophecies. For better or worse, employees end up performing like their managers believe they will. So what you should notice in reading this is that this is actually a comma splice, two complete sentences or two independent clauses on both sides. So let's see how they fix it. Choice B, notice they take out the comma, and now you just have two complete sentences that are put together with no conjunction or anything, so B is not going to work. B could you can make it better if it said managers' expectations regularly become self-fulfilling prophecies because for better or worse, blah blah blah. Not a great addition, but that would make B work. Choice C, notice what they're doing. They're putting a colon right after become. Managers' expectations regularly become self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, even if the sentence ended there, that would not be a good use of a colon, because colons generally are used when you want to give examples or explanations or lists, and usually you have a complete sentence before the colon, and then afterwards it could be a single word or it could be a complete sentence, but you never interrupt a verb and an object, like subject, verb, object, with a colon. So that wouldn't work. If it said something like, in the workplace, managers' expectations become self-fulfilling prophecies, and then a colon, because the next sentence explains the first, that would work. And that's actually what choice D does. So D is going to be the answer, and we'll go with that one. 24, start at sentence 2. Researchers have long known that both positive managerial expectations can lead to increased employee performance, and that supervisors often have difficulty communicating such beliefs, especially if it is not sincerely held. So notice all the answers have to do with this pronoun. So the question is, what is it referring to? So clearly when you read it, it is referring to the beliefs. So beliefs is plural, not singular, so that's going to eliminate that and this as well as it. So really the only choice that you're left with is they, and that's the answer. Question 25, start at sentence 3. For example, subtle nonverbal signals such as facial expressions operate on a subconscious level, betraying and showing bosses true feelings. So what's going on here? Right after level, we have a participle phrase because it's a verb, which you add an ing, becomes an adjective. It's describing the facial expressions. But what's going on? They're saying betraying and showing a boss's true feelings. So for some reason on the SAT, they like this use of the word betray. Betray, you probably normally think of one person like stabbing the other person in the back, but betray can also mean to reveal or to show. So if I say something like, oh, your facial expression betrays your feelings, it means it's showing or revealing your feelings. So this is a good use of the word betray, but it is redundant because betray basically means to show. So you don't need to say both. So A is going to be out, and B solves that problem by basically getting rid of showing, so that'll probably be the answer. Choice C, it operates on a subconscious level beyond conscious awareness. So notice if you say subconscious before and then beyond conscious awareness, that's also redundant, so C is out. Choice D, and these signals betray. So the problem with D is, technically you can argue it's grammatically fine, but you're really just repeating the word signals, which was said all the way up here. And so stylistically, it's just not as good as choice B, because again, there's no reason to repeat words if it's not necessary. So we'll go with B, and that's going to be the answer. Question 26, the writer wants to add the following sentence to this paragraph. Thus, managers' words may tell one story and their faces another. So one clue is this word thus. Thus kind of means like therefore. So you're looking for a place where this idea of their words saying one thing and their face is another, you're looking for a place where that has already been stated. So out of all the choices, the only place where that really works is sentence 3 that we just read, where it says, for example, subtle nonverbal signals such as facial expressions operate on a subconscious level, betraying bosses' true feelings. So this is talking about the disconnect between facial expressions and true feelings, or maybe the fact that one is showing the other. This would be the only appropriate place to put this addition, because this is sort of just the conclusion that's drawn from that phenomena. So the answer here is going to be choice C. Question 27, let's start reading from up here. In the 1960s, an experiment at the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company demonstrated how can ambitious goals powerfully communicate positive expectations. So I'm not exactly sure of the technical explanation for this. If anyone knows it and can give me like a link to a website, feel free. This is something that you often see in spoken English, like speeches or presentations. So to simplify the sentence, I could say the company demonstrated how goals can communicate expectations. And so that's the proper form, and I'm going to write it out over here. All right, so I simplify this a lot. It says the company showed how goals can show expectations. Grammatically, this is okay. What you often find is that when people speak, if they say something like the company showed how, they invert it and they say the company showed how can goals show expectations. And so this is kind of like a fused sentence, because if you were to say this part by itself, you can ask how can goals show expectations? That's a valid question. But if you attach it here, the company showed how can goals show expectations, then it's kind of like you're taking this first part and you're overlapping it with the second part of the sentence. So in English, the proper order is you put the verb after the noun. The company showed how goals can show expectations, versus the company showed how can goals show expectations, which would make you think that there should be a question mark at the end. So this is just something that I don't really have a real explanation for, but it is something that you do see and hear often. So really the answer then is going to be choice D, because it fixes that problem. Notice choice A and B are wrong for the same reason. You put can right over there as the first word. So that's going to be out. Choice C, the company demonstrated how ambitious goals can powerfully communicate positive expectations. So C and D are exactly the same except for punctuation. And like I said before, when you phrase it that way, you might have the urge to put a question mark there, but technically you really shouldn't. Question 28, which choice most effectively supports the idea in the previous sentence? So remember, the previous sentence said there was that experiment in which MetLife company demonstrated how ambitious goals can powerfully communicate positive expectations. So it's the goals leading to the expectations. Next sentence, let's read it. One of the company's district managers selected his 6 best insurance agents, placed them under the leadership of his best assistant manager, and tasked the group with a lofty sales goal, which acted as a clear sign of management's confidence in the group's abilities. So I'd say this is a good echo of the idea before, that ambitious goals communicate positive expectations. So A seems like it'll work. And task the group with a lofty sales goal. The manager would report the results of the experiment at an industry meeting in 1963. So doesn't really have anything to do with communicating powerful expectations, unless you were really reading into it that, oh, they're going to report the result at an industry meeting, so that's the expectation. Not as direct as choice A, so B probably not going to work. Choice C, sales goals are typically set once the market potential of the product has been determined. That might be true, but again, nothing to do with this idea of ambitious goals communicating positive expectations. As part of a plan, based on the manager's observation of trends at various insurance agencies. Also, nothing to do with the original idea. So basically A is going to be the best choice. B was the second best, but I think A is better. Question 29, which choice most effectively combines the sentences at the underlined portion? So let's read it. People within the company began referring to this group as the super staff. The 6 agents who made up the group performed accordingly, boosting performance of the agency by 40%. So definitely some redundancy by repeating the word group. So when they combine it, they're probably not going to do that. Let's see what they give us. Choice A, referring to them as the super staff, and the 6 agents performed accordingly. That seems to make sense. The 6 agents is obviously referring to the staff. B, referring to this group as the super staff, and the group made up of 6 agents performed. So notice B is just a little bit more wordy than A. Instead of saying the 6 agents performed, they're saying the group made up of 6 agents. So probably not necessary to say that the group made up of 6 agents, so a little bit redundant. Choice C, referring to this group as a super staff, they, the 6 agents, performed. Again, you don't need to use the word they, since 6 agents by itself would get the idea across. So C, definitely worse than A. Choice D, with the agents, all 6 of them performing. So again, B, C, D all have the same error. It's kind of redundant by saying 6 of them and agents when we're talking about the same group of people. The simplest way to do it would be to say, and the 6 agents performed accordingly. So A is going to be the answer. Question 30, writer's considering deleting the underlined portion. Should it be kept or deleted? So remember on these, often the choice between keep versus delete, it can go either way because a lot of times it's subjective. What you want to pay attention to is the reasons for keeping or deleting it, even if you think it should be kept or deleted. So let's read it. Provided employees with learning opportunities such as attending a professional conference or taking an online course also communicates positive expectations because such activities signal to employees that they possess skills and abilities worth developing. So my personal opinion is that we should probably keep it because you might be curious what the learning opportunities are, and the underlined portion between the dashes basically explains or gives examples of the learning opportunities. So let's see what their answers are. Kept because it clarifies the paragraph's main point by offering examples of learning opportunities. So yeah, it definitely offers examples of learning opportunities. So A is okay. Kept because it provides a valid counterpoint to a claim about performance. So counterpoint would mean like an argument against a claim about a performance made in the previous paragraph. Definitely not doing that, so B is out. Now let's look at the reasons for deleted, even if we disagree. It fails to effectively set up the discussion of the research that follows in the paragraph. I don't really think that that's the point of doing this, so C is not going to work. Choice D, deleted because it introduces a detail that undermines the passage's argument about employer expectations. Undermine means to weaken. So this extra information about what the learning opportunities are definitely doesn't weaken the author's or the passage's argument about expectations. So D is going to be out also, and A is the best choice. 31, however, the research team noted that some bosses were biased. They made these activities available only to employees they considered to have high potential, a behavior that risks creating a situation in which employees considered to have low potential fail to develop their skills. So you should hear what's wrong with this. In other words, what's the subject that's attached to risk? It's behavior. And so behavior is third person singular. What you need is risks with an S. And so the answer is going to be choice B. Notice what choice C and D do. They change the actual tense. So we're using present tense to talk about a general truth. Doing that is a behavior that generally risks creating that kind of situation. There's no need to use past, or in this case it's present perfect. Present perfect could mean something that's happened multiple times in the past, or something that you have experience with, or something that you were waiting for and it was happening up until a certain point. Choice D, that's present progressive. That means it's kind of actively going on now. And so we're more talking about a general trend or a truth. So we don't need present progressive in this particular case. And you should, by the way, for every verb, be able to fit it into this chart. Is it singular? Is it plural? And is it first person, second person, third person? And that's I, you, he, she, it, we, and they. So for present tense, for the verb risk, in present tense, you should be able to say I risk, you risk, he, she, it risks, we risk, they risk. And each of these can be applied to a single tense. So you should be able to do this for any verb, present, past, past progressive, all 9 tenses, just to keep that in mind. Question 32, which choice provides the most effective transition from the previous sentence? So the previous sentence just talked about a possible negative. It's a risk that creates a situation in which employees considered to have low potential fail to develop their skills. Let's read the sentence. In determining an employee's potential, supervisors should make these experiences available to all. So we are talking about employees' potential. I don't know if it's a great connection to this possible risk that they might not consider those types of employees. So let's look at what it says. In spite of inevitable failure, supervisors should make these experiences. So there's no indication that supervisors will inevitably fail, so that doesn't make sense. Choice C, though some of these skills are more difficult to learn, supervisors should make those experiences available to all. That's okay. Let's see what choice D says. To avoid this pitfall. So D is probably going to be the best answer, because if you're talking about the risk in which employees considered to have low potential do not develop their skills, that's definitely a potential pitfall. And then they're saying to avoid this, supervisors should make this available to all. So it's offering a solution. So for 32, D is going to be the best choice. 33, start over here. The evidence is clear. Managers and staff alike benefit from an atmosphere that expectations are high and opportunities to exceed them are abundant. So obviously this should sound funny to you, because you wouldn't use the word that to describe an atmosphere or a situation. Atmosphere is kind of like a place word. So for places or locations, you generally want to use in which or where. So if you say something like, oh, that's the park where I met my friend, or that's the park in which I had a lot of fun. So where or in which for locations. When do you use the word that? Typically for nouns. So if you said something like, the evidence is clear, managers and staff benefit from a workplace environment that rewards hard work. And in that case, you'd be turning the environment into more of like a subject. In this particular case, atmosphere is clearly like a place or a location. So let's look at the choices. A is not going to work. C is obviously good. Choice B, in that. In that is an interesting phrase. It's usually used to expand on something. Technically, it means for the reason that. So if you say something like, I am lucky in that I have a lot of friends. I just Googled that one. That's what it says. It means like, I am lucky for the reason that I have a lot of friends, or I'm lucky in that I have a lot of friends, or I meant to say I'm lucky because I have a lot of friends. So that's the usage of the word in that. Choice D, managers and staff alike benefit from an atmosphere which. So if you were to use the word which after atmosphere, they benefit from an atmosphere which promotes hard work. That would work as a sentence. And in that case, you can probably use that or which. And the difference between that or which, I'm not really going to talk about now. But that would be a proper use of the word which. In this particular case, we're just talking about that something is going on in this atmosphere. And so the best choice would be C. Question 34, start reading in the very beginning. This is about postal privacy. In his 1928 dissent on the case of Olmsted versus the United States, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis pledged that phone conversations are subjected to privacy protections under the Fourth Amendment. All right, so this is obviously diction, which is word choice. What is the best word to use here? The subject is the Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. Now, pledge is a word that usually means that you promise something, like I pledge $500 or I pledge my allegiance. Given that he's a Supreme Court Justice, he's generally not going to pledge that phone conversations are under the Fourth Amendment. He's really just going to say it, or they're going to declare it. So B is probably going to be the answer, because assert is just kind of a neutral way of saying that he says it. Choice C, he actually is the one, or Supreme Court is the one who's got the power to make that decision. So they're not really going to demand it. You might say that the people demanded it, and then the Supreme Court responded. Choice D, divulge means to reveal, like you divulge information, you divulge a secret. So in this particular case, it doesn't really make sense, and so the best choice for this is B. And if you're not really sure about these words, then I would just recommend using a dictionary. I like Merriam-Webster. You can go to merriam-webster.com, look at all the definitions and look at the example sentences, which is usually the best way to get a sense of how words are used. But for this type of problem, you either know the word or you don't, and unfortunately there's not a lot of logic. It's more luck here. Question 35, it's the same sentence. So Louis Brandeis asserted that phone conversations are subjected to privacy protections under the Fourth Amendment. So again, this you can say is more like idiom. It's kind of how words are put together. When you use the word subject like this as an adjective, the proper way to use it is subject to. And it has a very specific meaning, which I want to show you, again, using Merriam-Webster. So we're going to go over here. It's this use number 3. It says, contingent on or under the influence of some later action. The example sentence is, the plan is subject to discussion, which means that the plan is going to be influenced or depend on the discussion. So going back to the test, if they say phone conversations are subject to privacy protections, that means it falls under that dominion, or it's going to be dependent on privacy protections. So let's look at the other choices. Choice B, it says phone conversations are subjects of privacy protections. If you're saying it like this, it sounds like, citizens are subjects of a kingdom. And so that's kind of the sense that you get. So improper use or different use of the word subject. Choice C, phone conversations are the subjection of. So subjection is usually used in a way that you're under subjection or you're under somebody's rule. So not really appropriate here. And the original choice, they're subjected to privacy protections. So if you're saying subjected to, again, it's usually used for people. Like people are subjected to certain laws, or they're under the influence of certain laws. And that would probably be the most common use of using subjected with an ED. Just to show you real quick, that usage of subjected to, it's actually this usage where subject is a verb. So look down at definition 3. To cause or force to undergo or endure something unpleasant, inconvenient, or trying. Somebody or something was subjected to constant verbal abuse. So that's what I was talking about for that one. Question 36, let's read it from sentence 2. Brandeis's argument is a key precedent for modern legal interpretations of the Fourth Amendment. Sounds okay. Notice that all the other choices are really, we're talking about the level of formality. In other words, this could be said to be tone or how formal you want something to be. In general, on the SAT, essays like this, you want to lean more towards the formal direction. So let's look at the other choices. His argument is a key precedent for lawyer-type thinking these days. Again, too informal to say lawyer-type thinking. Key precedent for the things legal bigwigs say. So legal bigwigs is a term that sometimes people use for lawyers. Again, too informal, usually just used in spoken language. It's a precedent for what law pundits have reckoned lately regarding. So again, reckoned lately regarding, also too informal of language. So A is going to be the best one for written English. Question 37, to make this paragraph most logical, sentence 5 should be placed. What does sentence 5 say? However, the U.S. Constitution makes no explicit reference to such privacy. So these are our clues. Number 1, sentence 5 is contradicting something, and the previous sentence has to be talking about some type of privacy. So my opinion is you could probably make an argument that you can put this after sentence 1 or after sentence 2. I don't think it would be terrible, but the reason it's after sentence 3 is, I'll show you, let's read it. It says, indeed, the influence of his argument has been so widespread that many in the U.S. today assume that the Fourth Amendment plainly guarantees a right to privacy. So the statement here is that this is so widespread that we just assume that the Fourth Amendment guarantees a right to privacy, yet they're saying this is actually not in the Constitution. So in terms of a continuation of the idea, putting it after sentence 3 does make the most sense. However, if sentence 3 weren't there and something else were written, I'd say after sentence 1 or 2 would be okay. Certainly after sentence 4, where it is now, it doesn't really make sense, because notice that sentence 4 says, Anuj Desai basically says the guarantee can be ascribed not to the Constitution, but to the early history. So he's kind of agreeing with statement 4. So statement 4 and statement 5 are kind of in agreement. So you wouldn't use the word however there. So regardless, their answer is going to be D after sentence 3. Question 38, which choice effectively develops the information earlier in the sentence and sets up the information in the sentence that follows? So let's read it. As tensions between loyalists and revolutionaries escalated during the 1770s, the British-controlled colonial postal service became an increasing source of concern, even though the American Secretary Lord Dartmouth wanted to avoid going to war, and in response, they established an independent mail service. So when you're reading this, you should be like, what does the fact that Lord Dartmouth not wanting to go to war has to do with what they're talking about with this British-controlled postal service? So A, not going to work. B, but new taxation measures were the immediate catalyst for the outbreak. Again, that might be true, but we're not really talking about taxes. We're talking about, the postal service and privacy. Choice C, with colonists of both affiliations fearing access to their private communications by opponents. So that one seems to work because we're talking about the British-controlled postal service being a concern, and then they wanted to establish their own independent mail service. Choice D, and Benjamin Franklin's partner, newspaper publisher William Goddard, was one of its vocal critics. So, that one's closer related to the previous part that there was the British-controlled postal service. It doesn't really develop the idea as well as choice C. So we're going to go with that, and that'll be the answer. Question 39, start reading over here. In response to this anxiety, the Second Continental Congress established an independent mail service in 1775 that had provided safeguards for confidentiality, such as blah, 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 blah. So notice all these have to do with tense. And the original choice is past perfect, had provided. On the SAT, you only use past perfect when you're talking about two events that happened in the past, event 1, event 2, and this is now. You use past tense for the later event or the latter event, and you use past perfect for the event that happened before. So in this particular case, they're not trying to say that the mail service had provided safeguards and then it was established. In other words, this is the verb. We got one verb here, established, and provided is your second verb. That's not the relationship. So A is out. Choice B is present tense, which doesn't make sense because this happened in the past. Choice C, they established a mail service that provided. So that makes sense because they're both going on in the past, so they both should have the past tense. So C is probably going to work. Choice D also doesn't make sense because that's future progressive. So that would be like saying they established a mail service that will be providing. You could say for choice D that would provide, because sometimes you use would as an auxiliary to talk about things that were ongoing in the past. But regardless, that's not going to work here. And so the answer is going to be C. Question 40, which choice gives a supporting example that's relevant to the sentence? So let's go back here. Same sentence. In response to this anxiety, Second Congress established an independent mail service that had provided safeguards for confidentiality, such as a provision that mail delivery shall be under lock and key. Whatever that means, it does go along with this idea of a safeguard for confidentiality. So A is going to be okay because it's a supporting example. B says, such as service to and from each of the 13 colonies, nothing to do with confidentiality. So B is out. Such as delivery 6 days out of the week, not confidentiality. D, the appointment of Benjamin Franklin as the first postmaster general. Well, unless Ben Franklin was known as like the person who would guarantee privacy, then A is probably going to be a better choice because it's a better example of a safeguard for confidentiality. Question 41, start reading on the previous page. Although the Bill of Rights had been ratified in 1791, Desai notes that the legal guarantee of private mail was established independently of the Fourth Amendment. So here we're kind of just paraphrasing this guy Desai. It would be like me saying, I stated that you are lying. When you use a phrase like that to refer to paraphrase speech, you really don't need any punctuation, comma, anywhere, because there's no quotation, that no need to set it off. So really the only answer that's going to work is choice B. Notice choice C puts the comma right between notes and that. Choice D puts a semicolon, or a colon rather, and we said that you generally don't use colons to interrupt sentences. You usually have a complete sentence before the colon, and then after the colon it could be an explanation or an example or a clarifying statement. So B is going to be the best choice here. Question 42, let's read the sentence. U.S. Supreme Court justices, those who eventually held that certain forms of surveillance violated the Fourth Amendment, drew on a tradition of protections derived from colonial experience. So you can stop there. So notice what's going on in A. They're trying to set off this phrase, which is describing the justices, and they start by putting a comma. The U.S. Supreme Court justices, those who blah, 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 and the main verb is right here. They drew. So if you're going to put a comma here, you need a comma here after amendment. But unfortunately, they don't give us that option. So you can't put a comma here and not here. The SAT doesn't like you to be inconsistent. So A is going to be out. So let's look at choice B. Supreme Court justices and who eventually blah, blah, blah drew. So same issue here, and it's also introducing this ambiguity of why would you put, and, because we're talking about the same people. Choice C, what do? Supreme Court justices eventually held that certain forms of surveillance violated the Fourth Amendment, drew. So here what's going on is, let me delete this stuff. You've got two verbs with choice C. U.S. Supreme Court justices, verb 1, eventually held blah, 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 drew, verb 2, but you need a conjunction. You'd have to say U.S. Supreme Court justices eventually held that certain forms of surveillance violated Fourth Amendment and drew on a tradition of protections, blah, blah, blah. So you can't just have two verbs like that without some kind of connecting verb. It would be a word. It would be like me saying, I went to the store, bought candy. You have to say, I went to the store and bought candy. I went to the store in order to buy candy, something like that. So that only leaves choice D. It's like choice A, U.S. Supreme Court justices who eventually held, and this is still like a positive phrase that's describing the justices because drew is still the main verb, but you're not putting a comma right after justices because you don't have a comma here. So, in terms of consistency, it reads smoothly. Now, you could argue that maybe a comma is needed, but, comma usage oftentimes is more of an art than a science. So the fact that there's no option to put a comma here means they take it away from here, and that's the best choice out of all of those four. Question 43, start on the previous page. It says, in the 1878 case Ex parte Jackson, Justice Stephen Johnson Field crucially extended the meaning of papers in the Fourth Amendment to include sealed letters in the postal system, moreover making postal policy a constitutional principle. So that should sound a little weird to you because moreover essentially means like in addition. It's like when you add more information or you're kind of backing something up. Here, what's going on is they're talking about like this part, making postal policy a constitutional principle, is either a consequence or kind of like a restatement of what he did before, and so thus would be the better choice. It would be like saying, I did my 1,000 steps today, thus fulfilling my goal for the day. Looking at the other choices, conversely is always used to show like the opposite side of something. So these two go together, it doesn't make sense. Meanwhile, you use when two events or two things are happening at the same time. So it also doesn't make sense here. If you're not really sure how to use these words, moreover, thus, conversely, meanwhile. Just look them up on merriam-webster.com, which is what I'd recommend. Question 44, let's read it. In grappling with questions surrounding 21st century methods, courts will likely continue to be influenced by decisions made in colonial times. So here, what they want you to notice is you start in the sentence with a modifier. In grappling with questions surrounding 21st century methods, who is doing the grappling? It's basically the courts. So if you start with a modifier, the subject of the sentence, not necessarily the next word, but the subject of the sentence needs to be the person or the thing or the group that's doing whatever is being described in the modifier. Otherwise, it's called a dangling modifier, meaning to say it's a modifier just like hanging out or dangling with no connection or no clear connection to a subject. So automatically, you can eliminate any answer choice that doesn't have courts as a subject. It, decisions, influence, all wrong because they're all dangling modifiers. And so if you see that, this question becomes very easy. A is the only one that would work.